Welcome to the Consistently Good podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Cunningham. I've been a coach for a long time, and I was an athlete for a much longer time before that. And we tend to focus on the workouts. We tend to focus on the X's and O's of running. And we tend to fail to address some of the non-running components that aren't viewed as exciting or sexy, or maybe just not even viewed as particularly impactful. Iron deficiency, anemia is one of the things that I've seen derail workouts, derail races, derail entire training blocks, and even careers. We can discuss here today the cultural causes, the scientific causes, why it matters, and what the fixes are. Because at the end of the day, we're not just trying to stay alive, we're trying to thrive in our space as endurance athletes. So let's not delay, let's get right to it, and let's talk about your iron. Hey everybody, I'm excited and privileged, quite frankly, to talk to you guys about a really important medical issue that I think befalls a lot of people in endurance sports. Specifically, obviously, I coach running, but this is applicable across all sports and frankly, all walks of life. Iron deficiency, often thought of as anemia, is a big problem that really inhibits our ability to function in a space where aerobic capacity and aerobic exercise is literally the whole thing that we're doing, right? The reality when we're talking about anemia is that we can be iron deficient without necessarily being clinically anemic. I'm going to talk about sort of the genesis of the iron deficiency problem, and I'm going to talk about why it matters, and then we're going to go into the fixes, which are not particularly difficult and which are not particularly complicated, but you have to know that you need a fix, right? And so I'm going to go into sort of the cultural problems, and I'm going to go into the scientific problems that actually cause anemia and have made it sort of a epidemic that is endemic to the endurance space. When I say cultural, what are we talking about? Well, over the years, we have developed some certain cultural norms and biases that have actually fed into the iron deficiency epidemic. Bizarrely and counterintuitively, one of the problems is that we don't use cast iron skillets anymore, which is really funny and oddly specific. But believe it or not, our bodies actually had and have the ability to leach iron from cast iron skillets. We try to make everything easier, right? Everything from Instagramming to drive-through dry cleaners to pans that we don't have to scrub and oil anymore. So we use coatings, right, on our skillets. And so when we're cooking eggs or maybe cooking a steak on the stove or anything else where we might use a skillet, the food doesn't actually leach any absorbable iron from the pan when we have these coatings. Now listen, I'm not going to argue the fact that it's really, really nice to be able to go swipe, 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 rinse the pan, put it away, as opposed to, watching, a family member or you yourself having to just scrub the heck out of a pan and then oil it and do all the stuff that you have to do to take care of cast iron skillets. Well, we got rid of it because to a large degree, their use has plummeted because it's a pain in the butt, right? Some other specific cultural issues are, frankly, diet culture and the sort of bastardization of meat products and people eschewing the ingestion of red meat in their everyday diet, right? And not just red meat, but animal products in general have heme iron in them, which is the most absorbable iron. This issue started obviously way back in the 1900s, where we started becoming aware of things like fat, cholesterol, heart disease, trying to avoid heart attacks, strokes, things of that sort. And so in our attempts to try to protect our cardiovascular health, a lot of people stopped eating red meat. A lot of people have some moral objections to eating animal products, which I completely respect, but we need to be aware of the consequences of our dietary decisions and the consequences of carving certain things out of our diet that we as a species evolved eating. Physicians in the 60s and the 70s and going into the 80s started realizing that diets high in cholesterol could cause heart problems and could cause plaque buildup in our arteries. And, it's sort of amazing. You go in now to a doctor, and any time your total cholesterol, for instance, is over maybe 200, they say dietary changes, cut red meat, possibly want to put you on a statin, okay? And the reality of it is maybe 30, 40 years ago, cholesterol of 225, 250 was actually considered okay and normal. And then we started looking at ratios, and we started looking at triglycerides and LDL and HDL and all this stuff that goes into analyzing our blood health and the risk of heart disease. And they even have standards where they set out and they say, okay, your percentage chance of having heart problems goes up, right, when your ratios are at a certain level. If your ratios are over, say, 3.5, then they start telling you, hey, man, you probably ought to run more. You probably ought to lift more weights. You probably ought to eat more broccoli. You probably ought to eat more iceberg lettuce. And let's stop eating so much red meat as one of the things that they may advise you to do. Here's the problem. There's a lot of iron in animal products, specifically red meat. And what kind of iron is it? It's heme iron. And heme iron, Heme, is what is traditionally found, and not traditionally, it is found in animal products, right? Bison, pork, even salmon, beef, you name it, right? And so what we know is that heme iron has a bioavailability that exceeds the bioavailability of iron that's in plant-based sources. And when you look at the absorption rates and the absorption percentages of the iron in animal products versus plant products, you're looking at anywhere from 15 to 20%, all the way up to 40, 45% of the iron that is in animal products is actually absorbable. In other words, it has bioavailability, right? If you look at spinach, legumes, but specifically broccoli, collard greens, the green leafy vegetables, you're looking at anywhere from 1 or 2% up to maybe 15, max 20% of that iron actually is bioavailable. And so you can imagine the volume of spinach and the volume of broccoli that you would have to eat to actually be able to achieve the same levels of iron absorption that you would get from eating a bison burger, ground beef, steak, chicken, etc. And so while I understand, going back to the cultural issues, that we have people who decide to go the route of being a vegan or vegetarian, many times for some really, really good reasons and for reasons that I completely respect. And so what it requires for people who are vegans, vegetarians, or people who are pescatarians, for instance, right, is that you really, really understand your dietary needs, that you understand your dietary needs as they relate to your lifestyle. Now, if you're sedentary and you don't exercise much, you're not going to have the same level of iron needs as somebody who is a triathlete or a marathoner. And so knowing this, and especially when you're dialoguing with medical professionals, when you're dialoguing with your doctors, is really, really important. Because keep in mind, physicians see dozens, hundreds of patients a month, and each patient has their own individual story. Each patient has their own individual needs. Each patient leads a different lifestyle. And so physicians, in their defense, use basic norms, societal norms. Labs use basic ranges that are applicable to the general population. And those ranges and the sort of norms that the physicians and the medical professionals apply in talking to patients about their iron levels specifically are grounded in the fat part of the bell curve where most people fall on it. When frankly, if you're running 40, 50, 80, 100 miles a week, well, you're already out here on the edges of the bell curve as somebody who does not fit sort of the norms regarding the needs for everything, and not just iron. You're looking at vitamin B, you're looking at vitamin K, you're looking at vitamin D. I mean, everything is on sort of a different analytical spectrum, so to speak, if you are making these massive demands on your body. And so when we're looking at the culture, we have diet culture, the demonization / bastardization of red meat and animal products, and then you have people who have decided to go the vegan route and the vegetarian route. Okay, these are all things that we need to look at, including the lack of use of cast iron skillets. Now, when you're talking about some scientific issues and specific issues regarding running, you've got some other issues that we need to take a look at. One, do you live in a hot environment? Do you live in a cool environment? Why does this matter? Well, because when you sweat a ton, you actually lose some iron in your sweat, okay? And so if you live in really warm environments like here in Texas, anywhere in the South or in the desert Southwest where you're running in elevated temperatures, high humidity, you're at risk of losing more iron than possibly people who live in cooler climates. Women, through menstruation, lose iron. It's very simple. Losing blood causes you to lose the elements of the things that are in the blood, specifically iron. And if you're losing blood, then you don't have as much iron to deliver to your cells muscularly, which is needed for aerobic performance. When we look at foot strike hemolysis, and that's a term that I think may not be super familiar to everybody. Foot strike hemolysis essentially is the mechanical process by which you smash red blood cells on the bottom of your feet. And so it's a bit of a paradox, right? Because I spend so much time talking about get your volume up, run more. Well, when you're running more, you're doing two things. You're sweating more, and then you're also taking more footsteps. Hemolysis is a remarkably simple and uncomplicated concept that's very real. When you're smashing red blood cells on the bottom of your feet, specifically, you are damaging hemoglobin, okay? And then what happens is it gets released into the bloodstream, and the hemoglobin is actually damaged, okay? And so you don't have deliverable iron, okay, which then is needed for aerobic performance. And so your high mileage program, taking all those extra steps, is actually causing you to essentially leach iron, okay? So your menstruation, sweating, foot strike, hemolysis, all are causes of iron deficiency, and then we don't use skillets, and then we're reducing red meat or the use of animal products, and suddenly we've got a recipe for possible iron deficiency. All right? We take a look at why does this actually matter? There's a lot of people that may just say, hey, so what? Okay, so my iron is a little low. Well, what we know is that iron is absolutely necessary for mitochondrial respiration. And when your iron levels are low, you cannot engage, or your body cannot engage in mitochondrial respiration, which is absolutely vital in the aerobic process, which is thusly obviously vital for aerobic exercise. And so it matters because without iron or with low iron, you literally don't have the ability to perform at the level that you should or the level that you could. And when I say the level, we're talking about how fast you're able to run, how much you're able to run without overwhelming exhaustion, or the ability to actually run well, even if you don't feel completely exhausted all the time. You get to the end of a run, for instance, or the end of a race, and you try to hit the gas pedal and you can't go. It reminds me of that scene in Star Wars. I know I'm aging myself. The original Star Wars movie, when they tried to fix the hyperdrive, and so they think they fixed it, and so they're about to have to run from the Imperial forces, and they hit that hyperdrive, and it goes boo, 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 and nothing happens. That is what often happens when you are iron deficient. You're running along, and you're running nice and easy. And easy runs go pretty well. Why? Because you're not actually calling on the aerobic system to operate at its max capacity. And so if you're running sub-maximally, a lot of times you can feel okay. But then when you start trying to accelerate, and you start trying to run faster and faster, all of a sudden you hit the gas pedal and you try to go, and you get this whoom, 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 and the engine just won't go. And you think, that's weird. I feel oddly tired. I feel lacking in sort of this late race or late workout explosiveness that I've typically had. I'm lacking punch. I just feel off. When we have these discussions at practice or after races, I'll often tell my athletes, hey, are you taking an iron supplement? Do you eat red meat? How often do you eat red meat? Why or why not? And we can draw some conclusions that might lead me to say, hey, or suggest, hey, why don't you go get your blood work done? Just go get it tested. Let's go and take a look to see what's going on. For the most part, getting blood work done is a little bit of a hassle, but it's not nearly as big of a hassle as having your running career on the rocks. It's not nearly as big of a hassle as having it dip so low where you go deep into the abyss of actual clinical anemia and then have to spend so much time walking yourself out of this hole that you've dug for yourself. You don't want to be in the bottom of the Grand Canyon when it comes to iron deficiency or anemia and then have to walk all the way out. We're going to have dips, and that's okay. But when we recognize that we're in a dip, we can fix it. And so how do we recognize that we're in a dip? Possibly go get your blood tested. I would suggest, at least 2 to 4 times a year would be really, really good idea, right? Because then if you reduce the number of weeks, you reduce the intervals sort of between getting blood work done, then you can avert a bigger problem down the line by catching it pretty quickly, all right? And so why does it matter? You don't want to be constantly trying to hit the gas pedal or trying to figure out why you can't go when the solution might be actually pretty simple. Supplementation, eating more iron-laden foods, understanding the how and the when and the why to address your iron. So when we start looking at getting a blood test done, we need to know what we're looking at and what we're looking for. Now, this is an interesting part of the discussion for me because what I find is for coaches and athletes and people who operate in the space of endurance sports, whether participation or coaching or as a medical professional, we're all pretty adept at knowing what to look for, knowing what optimal levels are. And when I say levels, what I mean is there's, like I said, the fat part of the bell curve, levels that labs use, that's taught in medical schools, right? Where they say, okay, let's be really good at keeping people alive, right? And that's across the whole gamut of medical issues and medical considerations, not just iron saturation levels, et cetera. But we're seeking to thrive. We don't want to just stay alive. We want to thrive. And with the pressures on physicians and the pressures on people who are medical professionals, the obvious frontline concern is keep people alive. I mean, the most obvious thing is if you're an ER nurse or an ER doctor, right? When you have somebody who comes in with a stab wound or is having cardiac arrest, right? You're there to keep them alive. You're not going to sit here and go, man, those iron levels look a little low. Let's address that. No, I mean, you're sitting here trying to figure out how to pluck a slug out of somebody's abdomen or stop bleeding from an artery. Your concern is not some little numbers on a blood test and iron that might be inhibiting somebody's ability to close a marathon in under 6 minutes. I mean, that's not the thought process. And so what happens is, even in medical schools, and they're looking at labs, they're like, all right, how is this person living? Are they alive? And a lot of times they don't really drill down on the minutia in your blood test to ensure that you can thrive. And so a lot of times it can be really helpful if you go in as an educated patient and as somebody who's on top of your own blood work so that you can then help a medical professional who is tasked with ordering the blood test, knowing exactly what to order in the blood test, because all blood tests are not created equal as far as what they actually test. You can say, hey, make sure that you include ferritin. And this is the first thing I want to address. A lot of times when you get a blood test, they will look at your hemoglobin, your hematocrit, your total iron, for instance, but many times your ferritin levels will not even be tested. Why does that matter? Ferritin is not iron itself. Ferritin is an iron-binding protein. Ferritin operates as the warehouse. Well, each one of these storage units is like ferritin. I mean, ferritin is an iron-binding protein that will warehouse your iron, okay? And in situations where it's called upon, then the ferritin will actually release iron. And what are those situations? Hard aerobic exercise, especially in situations where there's oxygen deprivation. We refer to it as hypoxia. Hypoxia is how we talk about the amount or the concentration or the percentage of oxygen in the air that you're breathing, okay? And so that's why a lot of distance runners go to altitude, because you can get some adaptations from breathing air that is lower in oxygen, essentially, okay? And then when you look at heat also can stimulate the release of iron from ferritin, right? So what you want to make sure, though, is that you've got high ferritin levels, not super, super high, because that's a whole different set of medical problems that we probably don't need to address any detail here today, because it's beyond the purview of the conversation. But the reality is your ferritin levels need to be at least 30 to 35 on the low end, up to probably 50 on the low end. Now, the max levels of ferritin run way up over, into the, like 100, 150 for some people is considered fairly normal, right? But when your ferritin is low, then that means that you don't have enough storage. You don't have the iron binding proteins that actually can store your iron and then will release it when you call upon it for use. And so think of ferritin almost like a leading economic indicator. We've all heard of recessions and depressions, right? And what economists will do is they'll say, okay, we're not actively in a recession, which would be clinical anemia. We are not actively in an economic depression, which would be the equivalent of clinical anemia. We see leading economic indicators that tell us that we're headed that way, where we may not have a fully healthy economy. Okay, this is very, very basic. Obviously, there's a whole lot of other considerations, but when you're looking at iron and you have low ferritin levels, that's sort of like a leading indicator saying that you're headed toward clinical anemia, so to speak. But the deleterious effects of having low ferritin and even iron deficiency, as opposed to clinical anemia, can be significant and potentially disastrous for competitive endurance athletes. In this conversation, I'm going to be focused primarily on runners. So when you go to a doctor and they say, well, everything looks fine, the answer is maybe. A lot of labs will tell you that as long as your ferritin is sort of at a base level, I think 12-ish, I would have to check on that, but I'm pretty sure it's right around 12 on the bottom end, okay? They'll tell you, oh, well, you know, your range of normal is between 12 and 100, 12 and 150, for instance, maybe, right, for men. And that might be fair for a sedentary person. If you're just, I've used this analogy before, if you're just a person that goes and is just walking down the mall to go and buy yourself a cheap pair of earrings at Claire's, right? Or you're going down there to Abercrombie and Fitch to go and get you a t-shirt, well, that isn't really the kind of exercise where you're going to notice any overwhelming fatigue. You're not going to have trouble performing the simple act of walking down the mall, walking down the aisles at the grocery store, sitting in your TV room, watching a movie. If your ferritin levels are at 12, your ferritin levels are even at 10, I mean, my gosh, your ferritin levels may be 8 or 9. You're probably not even really going to notice that much, if at all. Now, certain levels, it can be so low when you have clinical anemia. I mean, you're out of breath sitting up in a chair, okay? But for most people, it's not going to affect their daily lives. But as a runner, oh, it's disastrous. I once had a runner who complained of sore legs, who complained of just being punchless in her training, getting in races and not feeling like she has any oomph, for lack of a better way of putting it. And so I started thinking to myself, I said, maybe we ought to go get your blood checked. And this was really early in my coaching career. And this is the first time I really dealt with this, okay? And the reality is her ferritin was at an 11. And at the time, I didn't even recognize necessarily that was that big of a problem until this fantastic doctor here in town took a look at the blood results and said, holy mackerel, we've got an issue here. And supplementation was started. The ferritin levels went up along with other measurables. And literally within a few weeks, couple of weeks, you could actually start to see a precipitous uptick in the quality of the hard workouts, generally how she was feeling on her runs. And then, because this is a performance-based sport, how did the races go? Went from feeling really awful, not able to run well at all, to running one of the fastest times in the state of Texas within 2 to 3 weeks of beginning to even work on this. And then it got better and better and better as the ferritin levels and the other measurables went up. Okay, so when we're looking at ferritin, for endurance athletes, 35 is your floor, okay? And it really would be better if you were at, say, 50. So when you go get a blood test, one, ask for ferritin to be tested, because a lot of times the doctors or the medical professionals will be looking at other measurables to simply assess whether or not you have actual clinical anemia, which medically, of course, has been defined as bad, and non-clinical anemia means that you're fine. And they look at it in a very binary context that is not particularly helpful. It's not particularly applicable to the situation of high-level aerobic performance. You have to ask for ferritin. I can't state that enough. I can't tell you how many times I've had some people come back and say, hey, I got my blood tested. I says, all right, let me see your H&H, hemoglobin, hematocrit. I will get to those in a moment. Let me see your SAT levels, and let me see your ferritin levels. That way I can do a quick look at this, and if it looks like there's a situation, I say, hey, go talk to your doctor. I'm not a doctor. I'm a doctor of jurisprudence, which means I'm really good at suing people or defending people who have been sued, but I'm not a doctor. I've simply learned all this on the job because I've had to be able to be the best coach I can be and for you to be the best athlete that you can be, okay? Ask for the ferritin. That way they go, okay, yes, and it's very standard, it's very easy, but many times you have to ask for it. And then when it's tested, a lot of times you'll get a phone call, right, from the doctor's office, or you'll get an email that'll say, everything looks fine. And almost every time, they'll actually give you the blood test results, right? And it'll even have those sliding scales, you know, where it'll have green in the middle, and then it'll have like yellow or red if it's out of range. And if everything is in a green, you're going to get a double thumbs up. Not so fast, right? Because if your ferritin is a 13, almost every one of you will be told by a non-sport specific doctor or a lab that's not testing for your levels sort of in the context of your being a endurance athlete, inevitably they'll say, you're fine. And so you will proceed saying, well, they told me I was fine. Why do I still feel so rotten? It might not be something as exotic as you being, allergic to Aspergillus mold, or you having, the Epstein-Barr virus that causes chronic fatigue syndrome. It may not be as exotic as some autoimmune disease when they go and start looking for all these things. It might just be that you're trying to run 80 miles a week. You've got an attempt in an Olympic trials qualifier, or trying to qualify for the Boston Marathon, or trying to run your first marathon in 5 or 6 weeks, and you're just flipping tired, man. And then we dig deep. And we say, look at that right there. Your ferritin is a 13. No wonder you're trying to hit the hyperdrive and the Millennium Falcon, and it's just going womp, womp, womp at the end of repeat sessions, during tempo runs, during races, and then in more acutely sort of problematic situations, even just being able to go out and jog, okay? Ferritin is an acute phase reactant, okay? And so when you're testing for your ferritin, make sure that you don't test it right after you have a really hard workout, or right after running, or right after engaging in intense physical exercise, maybe doing like a high rock session in your garage where it's 85 or 90 degrees during the summer. Because if you go right in after these kinds of work bouts, these kinds of sessions, and you go and you get your blood test done, you could have elevated ferritin levels that could give you a false sense of where you are. So make sure that you don't go immediately after intense exercise or a workout and get your blood test done because you could get some wonky results, okay? When we look at ferritin, every once in a while you can have normal ferritin and then normal other measurables, but it doesn't seem to sort of be matching the way you're feeling. There's one other thing that we can take a look at, all right, that might be able to provide some insight if sort of most of sort of the standard ways of looking at it. And it's what's referred to is your soluble transferrin receptor levels. It's called STFR. And if those are extremely high, meaning that you might have a high level of situational need for iron, okay, you could actually have relatively normal ferritin levels, hemoglobin, and hematocrit levels. But if you have really, really high STFR, it could mean that you have almost like situational anemia or situational iron deficiency that might not have been readily sort of identifiable in sort of the more standard way. So STFR, you can get that checked, okay, but it's not anything that is sort of a frontline analysis per se when we're looking at sort of like the big elephant standing in the middle of the room when it comes to your iron levels, okay? Now, when we look at your iron saturation levels, this is one of the things that really needs to be analyzed, looked at, and make sure that it is on sort of that list of 6-point font stuff that's in these iron test results that you get back, blood test results that you get back from the lab or your doctor's office, right? And so when you look at your it's usually expressed as TSAT, transferrin saturation levels, right? You need to understand what those numbers are and why they matter. So saturation, I think that we all know what saturated is, right? You take a towel and you dunk it in the water and you pull it out, it's saturated. You take a dry sponge, you put it in a bucket of water and you pull it out, the sponge is saturated, right? Think of your iron the same way, okay? You have iron and it's floating around, right, in your body, floating around in your blood, hopefully. But it needs to attach to something. And so you have these storage units that are your ferritin, okay? But we want to make sure that iron is actually in the storage unit, okay? Because remember, ferritin is an iron itself. Ferritin is an iron-binding protein where the iron will attach to the ferritin. What do your SAT levels need to be? 20%, okay? 20% is your floor. If your TSAT levels are under 20%, that means that we have a problem as it relates to your ability to perform aerobic exercise, and you need to address this, okay? The upper level of your saturation needs to be 35%. So your TSAT levels need to be between 20 and 30%, meaning that 20 to 35%, excuse me, of your ferritin have iron that are actually binding to them, and that is what we want, okay? If your TSAT levels are over that, then you could have some other disorders, some other health issues that need to be addressed by your doctor, a hematologist. Don't ignore it. Obviously, if it's mildly elevated, there can be some really, really easy explanations for that aren't particularly concerning. Consult your doctors when you see this. If it's under 20%, also consult your doctor, okay? And analyze whether or not this is a situation that needs to be rectified through actions such as supplementation, transfusions, whatever, okay? So we want to have our ferritin at 35 to 50 on the low end. If your ferritin levels are at 60 or 70 or 80, that's actually preferable. That's really good because that means there's a lot of storage space for your iron. We love storage space, right? We don't want a house that was built in the 1940s with tiny little closets, okay? We love our new big houses, and what do we talk about? Storage space. I've got more storage space, okay? Except in this instance, you need storage space for your iron, not just to store junk. Thank goodness iron is not junk. We want to store it, okay? Let's make sure we have the storage space. But then we need to make sure that the storage is actually occurring. 20 to 35% is what your SAT levels need to be. All right, I want to pause just for a second to save you from the clutches of your PTSD from high school biology or maybe your college biochem class that I just induced. I want to talk to you about what I think is super important and is the latest, greatest product that BPN has now made available, and that is BPN Endurance Essentials. One of the problems that I've got as a coach is that there really aren't great multivitamins and great supplements that are specifically tailored to address the needs of endurance athletes. BPN understands that. BPN has met the call with Endurance Essentials. We've got vitamin K, we've got vitamin D, we've got chelated ferrous glycinate, and other ingredients here that specifically meet the needs of endurance athletes, because we know that these are things, forgive the expression, that go low, that we discover sometimes on a blood test, or that we discover haphazardly throughout our training when we maybe have a dip in performance. So use Endurance Essentials to augment your training. Use Endurance Essentials to ensure that your body is in 100% full functionality when we get to the starting line of races. Go to bpnsubs.com, pick up a couple of bottles of this, and I promise this could be a game changer for you. When we look at red blood cells and the interplay of how they are vital in the aerobic process, we look at basically two things. We look at hemoglobin and hematocrit, typically referred to as H and H. Now, hemoglobin is the part of the red blood cell, okay, that makes up really the majority of the red blood cell. Hemoglobin is what we have to have, all right, to be able to transport oxygen to mitochondria in your muscle cells. Hemoglobin is where the iron actually attaches, okay? And then an oxygen molecule can attach to your hemoglobin, and then it will carry the oxygen to the mitochondria in your muscle cells. Now, when we're talking about mitochondria, obviously, in sort of layman's terms, it's sort of the engine that makes the cell go. While maybe not completely scientifically exactly what that is, for the purposes of this conversation, the mitochondria is the little engine that could. It's what makes the cell go. It is what allows us to engage in oxidative respiration, okay? And so when you have high levels of hemoglobin, then typically that means you have a high level of an ability to then carry oxygen to working muscles so that you can perform and you can run really fast, really far. Hemoglobin levels in men tend to be a little higher than women. For the men, we want our hemoglobin levels to be in the range of 13 to 16. Okay, and then for the women, typically like 11.8, right at about 12, okay, up to 15. Those are the ranges where you want your hemoglobin to be, okay? If you're below that, typically, not always, but typically, that means you're probably clinically anemic, okay? If you are at the very, very bottom, like if you're at 11.9, as a lady, or if you are at 12.5, 13 for a man, I mean, literally right at the bottom of what's considered normal, consult your physician. Take a look at this because it could mean that you're trending low, okay? But 13 to 16 for men, 12 to 15 for women is where we want that. And so when we look at your hemoglobin, we want to make sure that you have those adequate levels so that you have the ability to actually transport oxygen, right? And it won't occur. You cannot transport oxygen without iron. You have to have hemoglobin, you have to have iron, and you have to have oxygen. You need all three, but if you don't have iron, then even if you're breathing in plenty of oxygen-rich air, I mean, heck, you could get pulled over to the sidelines in a football game and you see them put those oxygen masks on guy trying to get a breather, right? It really doesn't matter. If you don't have iron, that oxygen molecule, the oxygen that you're breathing into your lungs, goes out through the alveoli into the pulmonary artery and goes into your body, okay? It won't matter. You can breathe in as much oxygen as you want. But if you don't have iron, that oxygen molecule can't bind to the hemoglobin, so it ain't going to make its way to the little engine that could, which is your mitochondria, which means you're not going to be able to run fast even if you're in a highly oxygen-saturated environment down at sea level, or even taking supplemental oxygen, for instance, if you come off the field at Mile High Stadium in Denver because you just ran an 80-yard touchdown, okay? So when we look at hemoglobin, we want those levels to be high enough so that you have the ability to transport oxygen. What is hematocrit? Hematocrit measures the percentage of red blood cells to your total volume of blood. Hematocrit in men is typically in the 40 to 50 range. And then for women, in sort of that 35 to 45 range is pretty normal for hematocrit. That means that if you say your hematocrit is 45, that means 45% of your blood volume is made up of red blood cells. Very simply put, that's what hematocrit measures. So there's some misconception out there every once in a while that hemoglobin and hematocrit are two parts that make up red blood cells, when that's not the case at all. The hemoglobin essentially is the red blood cell, and the hematocrit is the percentage of your blood comprised of those red blood cells. Okay, now hematocrit levels can have peaks and valleys. They can go up and down depending on your levels of dehydration, right? So if you are dehydrated and you go in right after doing a 13-mile run in 80-degree heat, okay, and you go have your blood test done, it could skew your hematocrit levels because your blood plasma volume is actually going to be temporarily possibly decreased because you've sweated so much that your basically the water levels in your blood have left your blood a little bit thicker than it would be if you showed up in a state of good hydration, okay? But for the purposes of testing your blood, just know that your hematocrit is going to be the percentage of your blood that's made up of red blood cells. You want your hematocrit to be 40 to 50 for men, in the range of 35 to 45 for women. I mean, these ranges can vary a little bit depending on the lab and, you know, in what some people deem to be normal, but those are some basic ranges. Men, it sometimes can be, you know, like 38 to 50, right? And so when we look at your hemoglobin and we look at your hematocrit, that's going to be part of your blood test. We want to make sure that we also get your ferritin levels tested along with hemoglobin, hematocrit. Hemoglobin and hematocrit are just standard. I mean, anytime you go and you get a blood test done, hemoglobin and hematocrit almost invariably are going to be tested, but still just make sure that it's done, okay? And so when we look at hemoglobin and the state that it's in, when it has an oxygen molecule actually attached to it, and then it'll arrive at your blood cells, I'm sorry, I said blood cells, it'll arrive at your mitochondria, okay? It'll be described as oxyhemoglobin, and then once it goes to the mitochondria, drops off the oxygen, it goes back into the bloodstream as deoxyhemoglobin. In other words, it doesn't have oxygen attached to it, and then it'll float around in your blood, and then you take a big breath of air, and then the oxygen gets into your bloodstream and the hemoglobin goes, come here, oxygen. And because you have adequate iron levels, then another oxygen molecule will attach it and it'll go from being deoxyhemoglobin to oxyhemoglobin, and then it'll march its way back to the mitochondria and will keep supplying you with oxygen. And you're doing a lactate threshold session, or you're in the middle of a marathon and it's like, oh goody, I feel good. I feel good. I feel good. You know why you feel good? Because you have oxyhemoglobin dropping off the oxygen, deoxyhemoglobin going back out in search of some more oxygen. And as long as you've got ferritin and the warehouse is full, and it goes, oh, we need more iron. And so then your ferritin will release some iron, and then your deoxyhemoglobin will have an iron molecule attached to it, and then it'll find some oxygen, attach it. Aerobic process, going. So you can imagine, if you don't have red blood cells, you've got a big problem. If you don't have oxygen, in other words, obviously, in the most obvious cases, if you're in outer space or you're holding your breath where you literally don't have oxygen, you probably aren't going to be able to engage in aerobic exercise. If you do not have iron, and even if you have the other two, you are not going to be able to engage in aerobic exercise. Iron deficiency has derailed so many races, so many training blocks, in some cases has derailed so many running careers. And in many cases, it's needless. And it tends to befall women, obviously, in vastly disproportionate numbers relative to men. Men can be anemic. Men can have these problems too. You need to get it checked. But men tend to run higher, and they tend to lose iron at lower levels, and they run higher in iron levels, generally speaking. Obviously, because men don't menstruate. Also, it's really, really important to me, and I know this can be a sensitive subject, but diet culture, the pressures to be skinny, the pressures to look a certain way. When I was a kid, it was cosmopolitan magazines. It was the tabloids that you would see standing in the grocery store line. Those were the social pressures, and then lifestyles of the rich and famous with Robin Leach and all this other stuff, right? And then the social media era hit, and the pressures are innumerable, and the pressures are significant to look a certain way, to be a certain way. And so then we got into diet culture. And diet culture has led people to do some really, really unhealthy things to themselves. Self-care is health-care. Taking care of yourself doesn't mean be as thin as I can be, or stop doing certain things because I want to be a certain way. And the problem is eschewing meat and not eating beef and not eating bison and not eating animal products if the goal is to somehow avoid getting bulky or muscular or maybe gaining a bit of body mass. If that's the goal, then that is lamentable, and we don't need to be doing that to ourselves, guys. And one of the things that we see, obviously, with people who maybe suffered from disordered eating or eating disorders, is a lot of the byproduct of that often is that iron deficiency or clinical anemia is just sort of along for the ride. It's part of the process. But then there's also some other really good reasons culturally. Like I said, like, hey, I don't want to eat meat for some principled reasons. Hey, those are really, really good reasons to not eat animal products, but you've got to make sure when we're getting to the fix, if we have identified that there's a problem, make sure that you are talking to a nutritionist, you're talking to a dietitian, that you're talking to your medical professionals to say, okay, I don't eat bison, I don't eat pork, I don't eat chicken, beef, I don't eat fish. I eat a vegetarian diet and a vegan diet in some instances. How do I make sure that my iron levels are good? My iron levels are adequate to engage in the rigors training for marathons, training for triathlons, being an elite level swimmer, cyclist, etc. So make sure that you're understanding your dietary needs. Legumes, green leafy vegetables, such as collard greens, spinach, broccoli. Those types of things are really high in iron. But the best sources, because of the bioavailability that I talked about earlier, are your meat products, right? Now, what do you do when diet alone won't be the fix? Because often it really won't get you there. Talk to your doctor about it, but supplementation is often the answer. Now, there's a ton of iron supplements out there, okay? You've got liquid iron, you've got ferrous sulfate, you've got ferrous glycinate, and chelated ferrous glycinate typically is the most bioavailable, and it also is really easy on the GI tract relative to maybe some other iron supplements. But I would say that this is an individual thing. I would recommend that type of an iron supplement, oral iron supplement, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only one that's going to be effective for you. You could have some GI tract issues that you may have with a certain type of iron that you don't have with others. And so some of it is a bit of trial and error, right? I recommend certain, iron supplements, and I take a look at a few and I say, hey, why don't you try this to some of my runners? And say, oh man, that one really irritated my stomach, but this other one didn't. Hey, that's great. Obviously, it can also cause maybe sometimes a bit of constipation. These are things that sort of go with it. So managing all of that is up to the individual, but it really, really try to supplement if you need to. What I find is sometimes people have anemia, iron deficiency anemia, low ferritin levels, or their saturation levels are low, or everything is low. Some people have low saturation, low ferritin, low hemoglobin. They're in a bad shape. They're anemic, but they say, well, the iron hurts my stomach. And so they just lay off of it, right? Sticking your head in the sand about the problem is not going to fix it. And you can beat your head against the wall going and doing all these workouts, be insistent on not ever missing a tempo run, not ever missing a repeat session on the track, okay? And be completely dialed in this area. But if you ignore your iron situation and you ignore the deficiencies that have been identified via blood work, fitness isn't going to stick to your bones, so to speak, whether it's a tempo run, whether it's a repeat session, because your body doesn't have the ability to perform at a level for you to even absorb the fitness, so to speak. So don't ignore the problem, okay? It's really, 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 really important, right? Now, in some cases, oral supplementation won't even get it done. And your doctors will take a look at it. If you're really, really low, then you might have to go the infusion route, okay? I had a runner recently who was at altitude, and they went and they ran a marathon, and things just didn't feel right. And even though it was a personal best by about a minute, I believe, something just felt off. Blood test got done a couple of months later, and there was a discovery that the ferritin level was at a 3. And I called them up and I said, hey, congratulations, you have just earned the most dubious distinction of any runner in my 24-year coaching career. What is that dubious distinction? The lowest ferritin level ever. Congratulations. Good job. All jokes aside, infusions was the answer there. I say infusions were, an infusion multiple times had to get done. I think 2 or 3. Don't get me lying there. What's amazing is there were discussions about tempo runs. There were discussions about intervals. There were discussions about the structure of those tempo runs. There was discussions about those intervals. There was discussions about the frequency of those workouts. There was discussions about whether or not volume was too high. All these discussions were had after the marathon that was good, but seemed to be maybe a little bit lagging behind where I thought this individual runner's talent level was, where I thought this individual level of runner could have achieved at this particular race. And so we started looking at the training. What did we do wrong? And we engaged in some really fruitful conversations in okay, well, maybe longer threshold sessions, maybe more long runs where we inject some pace at about aerobic threshold. But then when you got hold of the test results, you started realizing, hey, maybe there's something to this, and it wasn't so much the composition of the workouts, it needed to change a few things there, which I think is a fruitful conversation. Iron levels, boom. Now ferritin levels are up in the 50, 60 range. Oh my gosh, the workouts are just unbelievable. The ability to run farther, the ability to run faster, and reports of that felt so good, or oh my gosh, I just ran that pace on this workout, and frankly, coach, wasn't really that hard. I just feel so good. And so what I want for all of you to understand is that this very, very simple analysis, this really, really simple thing that we can look at if we know what we're looking at, ferritin, hemoglobin, hematocrit, iron saturation levels, can really, really keep us out of a really, really deep abyss. Now, when we are analyzing these blood tests, also know that there are some overriding concerns when you look at too much iron, and you have conditions like hemochromatosis, you have Crohn's and colitis, you have other issues that can be sort of explanations as to why your levels are either really high or really low. So you need to make sure that you consult your doctors to make sure that there's not something else going on. The vast majority of the time, there's not. So I'm speaking to sort of the majority of the audience who has pretty standard fare health issues that are related to your iron levels that are a pretty easy fix, whether it is supplementation or iron actually infusions from a doctor who says, hey, this is what we need to do. Now, also we need to look at whether or not we are taking our iron supplements with or without other dietary components, specifically vitamin C. Vitamin C aids in the absorption of your iron. So a lot of times you can drink a glass of orange juice with it or take a vitamin C supplement with your iron, and it will help your body actually absorb iron. What you don't want to do is take your iron in conjunction with a calcium supplement or calcium-laden foods, cheese, yogurt, ice cream, milk, things of that nature, because for whatever reason, and I don't really know why, the human body shares the same receptor for calcium and iron. And so it's kind of like trying to fit two people into the same airplane seat. It ain't gonna work. We gotta get two separate tickets, right? And so keep any consumption of a calcium supplement, consumption of, say, yogurt, milk, about 2 hours away either side of taking an iron supplement so that you can maximize your absorption, and take your iron supplement with vitamin C, and that will really, really help, okay? Just a little tidbit. A lot of people don't realize that, and it's a pretty simple thing to do. Just don't chug a glass of milk and then take an iron supplement, or you could be really cutting in to the amount of iron that you actually absorb from taking a supplement, okay? And one of the things for elite athletes that they need to be thinking about, okay, is that the World Anti-Doping Agency, the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, obviously monitors your blood work pretty carefully when you get drug tested. And one of the things that you have to be careful about is not having too high of an iron concentration, because it can raise some concerns that there may be something amiss. We've all heard of people getting banned in endurance events, or who are in endurance sports because of failing a blood test. EPO is a drug that some athletes take to stimulate red blood cell production, right? And so you have to be careful about having blood tests that come in sort of askew of standards. It's typically almost never a problem. I don't think that most people even need to concern themselves with it, but it's just something to sort of keep in the back of your mind. At the end of the day, this is a really, really important topic. It befalls, I would say, the vast majority of women at some point during their running career. I'm going to say vast majority. I'd say 60, 70, 80% in my experience. We will have people come back with blood tests. It might be just a little bit askew of where we would want levels to be. It's a dietary fix. Supplementation typically can really, really get it done and get you to a spot where you're going to be the best that you can be. You can run the best that you can run. For men, same thing. We need to be checking this. If you're sore all the time, if you have sort of aberrant levels of fatigue, or you're out there and you're running and you just lack punch, there could be something so simple like just taking a daily iron supplement, maybe injecting just a little bit more heme iron products into your daily diet. This is so important. I'm so passionate about this. I care about everybody who I coach, and I care about how all of you are performing. Even if I don't coach you, this is just absolutely vital. I've really enjoyed having this conversation. I know that it was like a high school biology class on steroids here. Forgive the expression when we're talking about running, but you get what I'm saying. So monitor it, take care of yourself. Remember, we're not trying to stay alive, we're trying to thrive, okay? So y'all go be good. And as I like to always say, let's be consistently good.